All right, so I want to start off with Easter first, and the biblical origins of Easter. And I am going to set out to prove tonight that this whole notion of Easter being pagan is a misnomer. It's misinformation. It is a regurgitation over and over and over and over and over and over and over by people who have gotten it one from the other and have repeated it. And you know what happens when you repeat a thing long enough? It becomes believed as fact. But in fact, it is not fact. It is fiction. And I'm going to attempt to clarify where the pagan idea comes from and how it has blended itself in with the celebration of Easter, Resurrection Sunday, as many of you call it. I'm going to call it Easter because I want to recapture and to reclaim Easter as a Christian holiday. Pascha was the name of that celebration. And so Pascha derives from the Hebrew word Pesach, which is the term for Passover. In the Greek language and in the Latin language, it is both Pascha, and this was the actual name for it in the first century, the second century, and beyond. In fact, King James translates the word Pascha to Easter over in the book of Acts. And that appears only one time. But when you look at the word, it is the word Pascha in the Greek. So where does the English word Easter, E-A-S-T-E-R, come from then? Where does that word come from? Well, you have to remember that the English language derives from a combination of European languages. One of them is of Germanic, and the other is of a Anglo-Saxon philology. And so again, because the Nords and the Anglo-Saxons had already named April as Eastermonath, and this was the month that they called their celebration of Pascha. So here's what I'm saying, as I don't want anybody to be confused. The early Christians from the 2nd century all the way through the 7th century called Easter Pascha. Okay? That's what they called it, Pascha. And it derives from Pesach, the Hebrew word for Passover. They celebrated it as a Christian Passover. Now, by the time Christianity comes to Europe, because, again, the Europeans were pagans. They were all pagans. From as far north to as far south, outside of the Roman Empire, Europe was steeped in paganism. And they worshipped all these foreign deities. Charlemagne brings Christianity by force to Europe. And so when they begin to adapt Christianity, they take Pascha, which was the name of the celebration, and rename it Eastermonath, identifying it not with the Passover festival, but identifying it with what occurred in April for them, and that was spring, the month of openings, or the budding of flowers and leaves. So it is the equivalent of what happens in our culture when people call all of the holidays that take place around December, they just call them the winter holidays. Excuse me. You notice how people are calling the holidays after what happens in that month, the winter holidays, as opposed to simply saying Hanukkah or Christmas or whatever. So the reality is that Easter, the word, derives from E-Stor, E-O-S-T-E-R, Monath, or the month of openings. So Easter means openings. It is the idea of what occurs in spring. So it has nothing to do with the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. It has nothing to do with the Canaanitic goddess Astarte. It has nothing to do with the Greco-Roman goddesses Aphrodite and Venus. Now, there were fertility cults in those cultures, indeed, and those celebrations did indeed occur in the month of March and April, but they have no bearing or influence upon Judaism or Christianity.
Where do I begin? The good pastor said that Pascha derives from the Hebrew word Pesach, which I agree. In Greek, Strong's G3957 tells us Pascha is the Passover supper, or lamb. In Hebrew, Strong's H6453 tells us that Pesach is the Passover. But that's where we part. Then he goes on to point out, in fact, King James translates the word Pascha to Easter over in the book of Acts. Let's take a look at that. Acts 12:4. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. It's there, but is that correct? The Eastern Bible Dictionary tells us Easter, originally a Saxon word, Eostre, denoting a goddess of the Saxons, in honor of whom sacrifices were offered about the time of the Passover. Hence, the name came to be given to the festival of the resurrection of Christ, which occurred at the time of the Passover. In the early English versions, this word was frequently used as the translation of the Greek word Pascha, the Passover. When the Authorized Version, 1611, speaking of the King James, was formed, the word Passover was used in all passages in which the word Pascha occurred, except in Acts 12:4. In the Revised Versions, the proper word Passover is always used. Vine's complete expository dictionary of the Old and New Testament words says, Easter, the mistranslated Easter in Acts 12:4, KJV denotes the Passover. The phrase after the Passover signifies that after the whole festival was at the end. The term Easter is not of Christian origin. It is another form of Astarte, one of the titles of the Chaldean goddess, the Queen of Heaven. The festival of Paschal, held by Christians in post-apostolic times, was a continuation of the Jewish feast, but was not instituted by Christ, nor was it connected with Lent. From this past, the pagan festival of Easter was quite distinct and was introduced into the apostate Western religion as part of the attempt to adapt pagan festivals to Christianity. Although the good pastor concedes there were fertility cults, he declares that Easter has nothing to do with the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. It has nothing to do with the Canaanitic goddess Astarte. It has nothing to do with the Greco-Roman goddess Aphrodite or Venus. But the online etymology dictionary says Easter, Old English Easterdag, from Eastre, from Proto-Germanic Austrian dawn, also the name of a goddess of fertility and spring, perhaps originally of sunrise, whose feast was celebrated at the spring equinox, from Ost, east towards the sunrise, to shine especially of the dawn. This was called an abomination in Ezekiel 8:16, when the 25 men had their backs to the temple, their faces towards the east, worshiping the rising of the sun. This is your modern sunrise service. Now, let's look at the names of the goddesses of fertility that the online etymology dictionary says Easter is named for. The Easton's Bible Dictionary tells us that Ashtaroth, the moon goddess of the Phoenicians, representing the passive principle in nature, their principal female deity, frequently associated with the name of Baal, the sun god, their chief male deity. These names often occur in plural, Ashtaroth, Baalim, probably as indicating either different statues or different modifications of the deities. The deity is spoken of as Ashtoreth of the Zidonians. She was the Ishtar of the Akkadians and the Astarte of the Greeks. There was a temple of this goddess among the Philistines in the time of Saul, under the name of Ishtar. She was one of the great deities of the Assyrians. The Phoenicians called her Astarte. Solomon introduced the worship of this idol. It was called the Queen of Heaven. Jeremiah 7:18. The children gather wood, and the fathers kindle the fire, and the women knead their dough to make cakes to the Queen of Heaven, and to pour out drink offerings unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger. Astarte, Ashtoreth, Ishtar, or Easter is the Queen of Heaven. The Encyclopedia of the Bible says, Ishtar, goddess of love and fertility, and mainly in Assyria, goddess of war. Though probably not mentioned by name in the Old Testament, she was worshipped widely throughout Babylonia and Assyria, where temples were dedicated to her in the main cities and chapels in many towns. In addition, at Babylon alone, there were 180 wayside open-air shrines for hymns and prayers to her as a goddess of fertility were frequent. This is where your rabbit and eggs come from, the goddess of fertility. She was the lady of the lands. She was revered throughout the ancient Near East, though sometimes under other names. She was identified with Isis in Egypt, the male deity Atar in South Arabia, Astarte in Greece, and Anat in Syria. In Judah, women were upbraided for making sacrificial cakes or incense for her under her title as Queen of Heaven. According to the Babylonian tradition, this goddess, as the Sumerian Inanna or Anini, descended to the underworld in search of her missing lover Tammuz, with the result that fertility ceased and women wept. In her various capacities, Ishtar is represented as the evening and morning star Venus. Ezekiel 8:14. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was towards the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. With all due respect, Pastor, the biblical Easter that you're talking about is an abomination.